Welcome to the Theology Pugcast. This is C.R. Wiley. I'm one of the hosts of the show, and I am a senior editor at Touchstone Magazine. How about you, Tom?
I'm Tom Price. I teach theology and Christian ethics at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and I minister in Connecticut on the east coast of the U.S.
All right, Glenn, why don't you take it from here? Introduce yourself and tell us what we're talking about.
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a retired history professor, work with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and that actually kind of brings us toward the topic of the day. I'm currently working on a book on the entire disenchantment, re-enchantment thing. And, there's a lot of facets of what I'm doing with that. But I've been reading books by people who are talking about re-enchantment. And the fact of the matter is, the vast majority of them that talk about this aren't Christians. Or if they are Christians, they're pretty unorthodox. There are exceptions. We've got the Eastern Orthodox Mafia with Jonathan Pageau, Martin Shaw, Paul Kingsnorth.
I like that mafia allusion there.
There's also Malcolm Guite in the Anglican world. I mean, there are a number of Orthodox people who are working in this, but a lot of the people who actually write books, if you look for recommendations of books, you'll find people who are Buddhists or who have a sort of New Agey kind of outlook on it, and they see. One of the things that sort of runs through a lot of these is they see a spiritual connection with the natural world. And in some cases, even beyond the natural world to man-made things and so on. And the people I've read on this so far are either animists or panpsychists. So I thought it would be interesting to start off and to take a look at these two ideas, and somewhat obviously, as Christians, we can't really go with those ideas entirely. But it turns out, I think, that we need to think about them a lot more than we do.
Yeah, I'm really eager
for reasons that we'll get into.
I'm eager to get into the panpsychism conversation because that's acquired a measure of respectability in some surprising places that I think it's worth thinking about.
Right. And of the two, panpsychism is the one that in some ways is most intriguing. But then there are other things that we can do beyond that. So let's start off with definitions of terms. Animism says that everything in the natural world has a spirit associated with it. And it is a fundamentally, its focus primarily is really on relationships. That you can and you should have relationships with everything in the physical world, because all of those things in a very real sense, are persons just like you are. So this includes not just animals or growing things like plants. It includes rocks and stuff of that sort. Everything has got a spirit attached to it. Now, panpsychism is slightly different. Panpsychism says that there is a kind of intelligence that is built into everything in the universe. And this goes all the way down to subatomic particles. So there's a kind of intelligence that even, say, a rock would have. It is not so much a spirit or a relational kind of thing, and it is certainly not a person. Panpsychism typically argues that simpler organisms have simpler kinds of intelligence. And it may be that more complex organisms develop their more complex ways of understanding and reasoning through the accumulation of all of these smaller forms of intelligence combining together.
And I think there's a way in which, the material, the way we conceive it, as though it could be some kind of physical stuff that can stand on its own is not the case. It's fundamentally consciousness that is behind all of reality. It is not. It basically is a flip of the way that materialism works. Is that matter is spiritual, and in some sense we'll get to that. It is, but here it is. It's like matter is almost consciousness at its roots, with a kind of intelligibility, or however they parse it different ways. But it definitely is something. There isn't something that we would think of today as the material world the way we think of it now.
Right.
So I think the thing to note at this point is just to let our listeners kind of get maybe give them a surprise. We're not talking about a bunch of people with crystals in a garage who are saying that the universe is conscious. We're talking about people like Roger Penrose. We're talking about people who are physicists who have gotten to the place where, and philosophers who got to the place where materialism as it was understood in the 19th and 20th centuries is breaking down to such a degree that they're entertaining things, ideas that maybe people would never have believed would come back.
Yeah. So actually, Tom, I like your word of consciousness rather than intelligence, but the two of them are connected in a lot of ways. We can even see this in the intelligent design movement. Intelligent design says basically that information is fundamental to reality, that all of reality is really built on information. That's a very small step away from panpsychism. Not the same thing, let's be clear, but it's very similar. So,
because even a Christian would say that everything has a certain intelligibility about it, but it's very different. It's anchored through its participation in the divine mind rather than it is something that is inherent to it. And that's an important distinction, but we can get there. I'll let you run towards it.
Yeah, before we do, though, I think it's intriguing that information has taken the place of the logos in functionally in the thinking of a lot of these people. So you could say, well, Christians have always believed in kind of an intelligibility, like you said, Tom, but that proceeds from God, and the second person of the Trinity is the Logos. Whereas in the case of, say, information theory, we're talking about people who really live in the world of computers, and their way of thinking is being sort of extended to the cosmos at large.
In the case of intelligent design, it was that idea is very specifically used as counter to Darwinism, to say that, there is a thing called specified intelligence, or specified information, specified information, which is information that, well, in a very real sense, is designed to do something. And there is no known way of getting specified information apart from an intelligent source. Therefore, the argument is that the universe had to be designed by an intelligent being. That's how they use it. So in a sense, they're bringing the logos in there, but they're doing it via this idea of information. Now, let's pause for a moment and take a look at panpsychism. Now, I'm not going to go as far as rocks here, okay? Although, again, some of these people that I'm reading talk about going out and telling rocks stories, going out and telling them your life story, and that kind of thing is a way of connecting with whatever kind of consciousness there is within the rock. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. That's literally what I've read in one of these books. But it turns out that you find a kind of consciousness or intelligence in a whole lot more of the natural world than we normally give it credit for. We don't really think about the fact that a lot of things in the natural world exhibit behavior that in any other measure is intelligent. They communicate with each other. There are all kinds of things that happen there. And I'm not just talking about mating signals or something like that. Okay, so let's pick one that everybody, I think, will probably be familiar with, bees. When a bee finds a flower, of nectar, a source for food for the hive, it returns to the hive and does an interpretive dance.
Mhm.
And in the interpretive dance, we've actually decoded them. It communicates to the other bees by the motion of the bee that found the flowers. It communicates to them the distance and the direction to fly to find these. So it is communicating with them the things that they need to know in order to collect the food. There is communication going on. It is conveying intelligent information. Further, when you look at what bees do in terms of building hives and things like that, there's actually a pretty remarkable degree of engineering that's involved in that. Okay, so that's a simple example. Now, does that mean that bees are persons and have the kind of intelligence we do? No, but they have obviously got some kind of intelligence. We can go to ants similarly. There are termites. There's a certain amount of engineering, and there is very definitely communication, cooperation, all of those kinds of things going on in ant colonies. How do ants? We've all seen a bit of food on the ground and swarms of ants around it. How do all those ants find it? Well, somebody in the colony located it and communicated to the others where it was, or laid a pheromone trail is actually how it happens, and the others follow it to get to the food. Okay, so there would be another example of a kind of communication that's going on, although not communication the way we normally think about it. It's communication via chemicals. There are, in terms of higher animals, there are loads of stories about crows, for example. Crows actually have an ability to problem solve. They actually make tools to make tools. Mm-hmm. There are all kinds of things that crows do, and crows are just one example. Again, lots of other of what we would consider higher animals also show evidence of communication, cooperation, in affection, things that we associate with personality. But how about if we move lower down on the creature scale, at least as we see it? Trees. Trees communicate with each other. Actually, trees communicate with each other via mushrooms. Somehow they work together and they send information to other trees. If a tree
I've known some people who are really into mushrooms and said that the mushrooms communicated to them all sorts of amazing things.
Yeah, well, there is that too. Mushrooms by themselves, by the way, are one of these things that give mycologists, they get really nervous about mushrooms because there are a lot of things about mushrooms that people just don't, even the specialists will say, I don't know what I'm dealing with here. But in any event, trees will actually, through the root system, through these mushrooms, they'll communicate with each other. And when a tree is injured, the other trees in the area will release chemicals into the soil to help repair the damaged tree. Okay. The point being that there is a kind of intelligence and a kind of communication that's going on here. And it extends much further than, and a lot of this stuff is really relatively recent discoveries. It extends a lot further than we would normally think of. Who thinks, aside from Tolkien, who thinks of trees talking to each other?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess this brings up something that's worth maybe considering in our conversation. People did kind of guess that was happening, maybe because of kind of an anthropomorphizing kind of approach. We read into it something that obviously is more human than tree-like or whatever. But it seems as though that we today, because of the subtlety of the tools that we have to be able to detect things that our ancestors wouldn't have been able to see or to detect, we're getting a better understanding than they had. But they had an intuition that was on the ball.
And I think one of the things is that they did not, again, think of these realities as some kind of self-standing, pure, natural reality. These things have everything that is alive has a soul in some sense of the word. That was characteristic of all of this. And soul, again, is not necessarily to be analogous to what it means to be a human having a soul. What it means is that it's alive, and that aliveness is not reducible to the bare material parts that make it up. There's a whole there that is not something that is supplied by the matter alone. And that unity.
What is the Latin word for soul?
Well, I know the Greek is this psyche and
Anima.
Yeah, anima.
Which is exactly where you get the term animism.
Animism, yeah, and animated, and all of those. But that's this relationship there, and so I think, I mean, if you go back to especially in the Hellenic world and places like that, I mean, being is primary, not matter. Matter is really nothing as close as you get until it has form. It's undifferentiated being. It's potential, but it's nothing. And so until it has form, and form can only be, in some sense, conceived of a way as animating something, actualizing it. And so everything has its actualization if it has a reality. So what is primary about is being, and then being tends to be understood as both intelligible and good. And because of that, it communicates its goodness for the particular kind of being that it is. And that has intelligibility. It has other dimensions. I think that you're catching on. The animist or the panpsychism, they at least are capturing something of that gets bracketed out in modern materialism or our reductionisms today. So they get a hold of something. They may run too far with it.
Speaking to that, the term animate, animation, there is a kind of openness in the East to kind of an ensoulment when it comes to our creations. So one of the things that people have speculated about is one reason why particularly Japan and maybe China and Korea as well are more open to robotics is because they really do think that there's something more to it than just the mechanisms. So the fact that they're intending to entrust the well-being of, say, elderly people to robots to care for them doesn't seem to, at least from what I've been told, doesn't seem to strike them quite as appalling as it does to us in the West.
Yeah, they see it almost as giving it a kind of soul by making it, and I think there's category mistakes going on, but they are onto something as well. That the things that we as humans make are not just matter; they're not just machine. No matter what, they're not just machine, and so there is. This is why you can never talk of a disenchantment in the materialist sense of the word, because these things can never be the kind of pure machine that pure material machine they're after, because they are, if they are at all, they're participating in being in some sense, and they're communicating that being as well. And if we've had a part in constructing it, we've kind of brought something to bear on it as well, and that begins to have a life of its own in some sense. What it is becomes a interesting topic, but it can't be just merely indifferent matter.
Yeah, and it turns out that, once again, the animists and the panpsychists I've been reading talked about human buildings and things like that as also effectively part of the natural world. So they would participate in this sort of thing as well.
Yeah.
Now, another thing, by the way, that's worth bringing up is that, at least in mythological terms, the way that the life of trees, for example, was typically expressed was through something like a dryad. a spirit that's attached to the tree. You also have Oread, spirits of mountains, Nereids in the sea, all of these kinds of things. So you would have, they would be ensouled, but the soul would be something that in principle it's connected to, well, let's just stick with dryads, it's connected to the tree, but it can also sort of come out of the tree and be a semi-independent entity that isn't directly connected to the tree itself. Well, it is, but it isn't. It can come out of it. It can appear to you. Those kinds of things.
Well, it's pretty clear that Goldberry in The Lord of the Rings is connected to the Withywindle. She doesn't go very far from it. Everything that she's kind of got associated with her has to do with water. So anyway, we'll keep talking while you're answering your phone there, Glenn.
I'm trying to turn off the ringer.
The trees are calling him.
Well, speaking of things that are alive, our devices speak to us, and our devices. And there are a lot of folks who think that there are spirits and souls being communicating through those devices. We've got a particularly demonic one that Glenn is dealing with right now in his phone.
I just turned the thing off. I was trying to get the ringer off, and it wouldn't give me the right screen to do that.
See, it's got a will of its own. It didn't want to be shut off there, Glenn.
Yeah, speaking of, well, at this point, I should say the demonic, but that's okay. So the point being that in an animistic sense, you have spirits that are attached to the trees. They're connected to the trees. If you remember the last battle, the dryads appear in the last battle and they die when their tree is cut down. So they're connected, but again, like in Tolkien, or excuse me, like in Lewis, they can sort of step out of it. So there's this, I think, is a characteristically Greek way of seeing things, in that the material form and the spirit behind it are connected, but are in principle separable. Yeah. Now, the interesting thing is that if you look at Tolkien and Lewis, they seem to believe that they at least suggested that it was possible that things like the Fae might be real. And they would be very directly connected to the land. They talk about people who have spent generations farming the same piece of land. In a very real sense, they are made of that land. It's the produce of that land that has fed them for generations. And as a result, they might have a kind of bond to the land that those of us in the modern world don't really have, which would then make them more open, or make the land more open to revealing itself to them in the form of the Fae and things of that sort.
Going along with that, is there something to be considered with regard to the rootlessness of our world today, particularly as it relates to the Prince of the Power of the Air? There's of course, that term that's used in Ephesians for the Prince of Darkness, and the fact that we are the soil, Adama, earth, soil. We are what it means to be humus, human. In other words, we are derived from the soil. If we lose touch with that soil in some way, do we become more subject to, say, the powers of the air? I'm just kind of freewheeling here. It's not like anything I've thought out at all. It's just sort of an interesting sort of set of connections.
Well, it's a strange one, because it's like, especially, if we're going to go right into like New Testament, you have a kind of, it's a complicated way of putting it, because on the one hand, the flesh, which is kind of the wrong way to participate in matter, it's like an overindulgence in matter, but it is a spiritual event. It causes one to become ensnared and open to these kinds of forces. You're given over. The flip side is this kind of this spiritual orientation of our material natures opens it to kind of life works, right? It gives birth to things. But You've had different ways of conceiving just the whole. I mean, think of it this way: the human being in some of the say Neoplatonism, which I know where Glenn's going to be going in this direction, but Neoplatonism had a picture that you have this one primary ultimate reality, being beyond being. It's their way of basically trying to say God, something that isn't one more thing in the universe, but is the unity of being and intelligibility and everything else. The first emanation of that, the first kind of move away from it, is the intellect. This is where the forms of Plato reside. Christians will hold it. This is the mind of God. This is in the being beyond being. But the next is actually the realm of the soul. That's the second emanation. And that is where that comes from the intellect in the forms, but it's the bridge between the intelligible world and the sensible world. It's that which takes the essences and the forms, the different ways of participating in being, and connects it to the material world. And so you'll have someone like the Catholic thinker David Schindler, who basically sees the human being this way as basically the one who, in making things, is a living soul that can reach into the intelligible realm and become like a demiurge and bring form to matter and make these kinds of things. And they would see all material things as being different ways in which soul has informed matter to be real, alive, animated. And the goal is, of course, matter to kind of to go back towards, reach back towards the source of it all to reach its perfection again, because it's somehow become imperfected by becoming material. This is where it differs from a Christian vision. It can be its own good material and be readied for eternity rather than having to kind of go back to this spiritual one. But I mean, it's interesting that soul plays such a gap bridging place in these earlier philosophies that inform some cases Eastern thought, but definitely pantheism and panentheism. The soul is a realm. It isn't simply what we have. What we have is sharing in that realm, and that realm is the bridging realm between the intelligible, like we were talking about, which is connected to being, and the material, which is the furthest thing away from it. Yeah.
At this point, I suppose we can move on to sort of the next step. Although, again, the point that I really want people to think about right at the start is the degree to which there is a kind of intelligibility or an intelligence that exists in all kinds of things, communication, that sort of thing, that exists in all kinds of things that we may have had an intuition about in the past with dryads and things like that, but we had no way of knowing about it. And now we're discovering that there are ways in which the natural world is considerably more, alive, and communicating and all of that sort of thing than we had any reason to believe even 50 years ago. Which is one of the reasons, I think, why the sort of animistic or panpsychist approach is increasingly compelling to people.
Yeah, and as I said, the people that are proposing this are not the sort of people that maybe our listeners have come to mind when they hear a term like panpsychism. We're talking about physicists, we're talking about scientists, we're talking about philosophers, and it's an approach to the question of consciousness that takes a completely different sort of tack. So, like Roger Penrose believes that our consciousness arises from the subatomic realm, and it's something that emerges from below, as opposed to now. But the thing about it, and this is why he's open to panpsychism, I think he is that's true for everything, not just human beings. So if we're talking about the quantum realm, everything has its origins in the quantum realm, and that's what Penrose maintains as the source of our consciousness.
Right.
And it becomes tricky to know exactly what does some subatomic mean for them matter in its most principal, its most fundamental elements, or is it something that has?
Well, I think, Tom, I think it's kind of like the particle wave problem. It's sort of it's a problem. It's a problem of perspective. So they would say it's matter, but they would also say it's not. So you could say it's energy, but even then we're not talking about, we're actually getting a lot closer to a kind of pantheism.
Well, that's it. That's what I was saying, is that you're not dealing with matter the way that a lot of materialists conceive of matter. So even if they're using that language and vocabulary, you're dealing with something that has already moved away from that, and it's open. It has an openness towards defining that matter more widely or openly towards something like consciousness and mind anyway.
Yeah, this reminds me of a famous statement. I can't remember the name of the physicist who said it, but you probably remember this, Glenn, because it's kind of famous in intelligent design circles, where there's this long trek up a mountainside until the scientists finally arrive at the top and they find some religious figure,
theologians waiting
sitting up there.
Yes, yeah, and that goes way back. I remember that from the 70s.
Yeah.
Literally 1970s. But okay, now what's going on here is that they believe that the quantum field is actually a field of consciousness.
Right? Yes.
And this is one of the reasons why some people like Simone Planté, who Diana Pasulka talks about in her book Encounters, she believes that quantum computing is going to allow us to connect into this unlimited field of knowledge. Okay, so again, now we're getting into some of the weird stuff there. But again, think about quantum. The results that you get in a quantum experiment change depending on what you're looking for. So you're looking at it ends up resolving what the quantum, whatever they are doing. I was going to say particles, but you can't call them particles either.
Yeah, this is the source of the crisis in physics in terms of the materialists. Yeah. They really don't have an ability to make their old case anymore.
Yeah. So the first question is, assuming that is true, that until you observe a phenomenon, you can't. The quantum leaves it unresolved. Who's observing it?
Mm-hmm. Right. This brings back George Berkeley. That's a guy that talked about this.
Well, this is where your idealist strain.
Yeah. Now, the fundamental problem. Now, quantum raises its own series of issues, and I'll be the first one to tell you I don't understand quantum mechanics. I'll be the first one to tell you that anybody who claims they do, who isn't a specialist in it, doesn't know what they're talking about. And the ones who are quantum specialists will tell you they don't understand it either. Okay, so
and just to add to it, it is neither here nor there of whether or not their philosophical case is sound or not, because the philosophical case isn't dependent on that kind of on that expression of reality. It's the fact that there is reality at all, which is more fundamental. No matter how it's exercised and jumps, that becomes a second question. But the fact that there is quantum reality means there is an is to which even that has to share in, which is logically and ontologically prior. And so their philosophy is going to be, also impacting how they read it.
Right. Now, the basic problem here, even leaving the quantum thing aside, the basic problem here is, how does consciousness arise, period? The materialists say that consciousness, specified information, all of those kinds of things arise out of inert matter. But they have absolutely no explanation of how that happens. And so the very fact that we have consciousness raises a serious issue for them, which is what is leading, I think, to people saying, well, actually, matter isn't what's fundamental consciousness is.
Well, and just to note, there's also, it becomes very problematic if you are what they typically go by the name materialist monists, that there's one kind of reality, monism, like monopoly. There's one who takes the whole. There's one kind of reality, and it's material all the way down. And so somehow consciousness has to emerge from that one stuff. And so you can look at it in a very narrow sense and say it is identical to just brain events happening in the physical brain. But that doesn't seem plausible, because any kind of description of what a consciousness experiences is never the same description of what's going on the neurological and brain event. And so because of that, you have the next move. It's called eliminative materialism. Eliminate the problem by getting rid of consciousness and saying that that's just folk psychology. That's just the way we talk about things because we don't understand scientific description. Or you have functionalism. This is the last one, which is the brain is the kind of sophisticated machine like a computer, which you have external stimuli which allow for the brain to basically do output. So somewhere you have emergent theories which say, well, maybe matter can get so complicated or sophisticated that it can produce something that it can't go back and be reduced to. So it depends on matter. It doesn't have its own substance. It belongs to matter, but it is something different than matter. And this is where you get this emergent theory of consciousness. This is called property dualism for those who are in philosophy class. But anyway, these are the kinds of materialist options that tend to run around.
Yeah. And I personally, the metaphor I like to use for the brain is it's an antenna. That the mind is separate from the brain, and the brain is just the interface between the mind and the body. Not perfect, but it's the best I can do with it.
In classic, I think Christian and Platonists and Aristotelians shared, and Neoplatonists, they shared the notion that you don't have to break into these differing kinds of realities that describe the human being as a rational animal. They're a unity that is, ensouled body or rational animal, and you're not rational or body. You're an ensouled body. It's a unity of those things. So it doesn't get caught up in the problems that the modern way of thinking about it. You're either a mind or a body, and you have to bridge the gap somehow. Classically, the soul bridged the gap. That was the unifying element of what being a person is.
Well, let's move. We've explored a lot of things related to animism, panpsychism, and some of these other things. Let's move to another theory that's out there that is, I think, very relevant, and in some Orthodox Christian thinkers, both small o and capital O in this sense, that they use to point to the significance of the natural world on a spiritual level. And that is panentheism. Now, terminology, pantheism, everything is God. Okay, that's not what we're talking about.
Yeah, matter and being are identical.
Yeah. Now, what panentheism says is that God is transcendent. He's above and beyond there are variations here, but God is transcendent. He's above and beyond the creation, but he is also immanent. That is to say, he is intimately involved with everything that exists in the world. Okay. Now, there are some versions of this that say that the universe is the body of God. That one we can throw right out. But the more sophisticated versions recognize that God is both transcendent and immanent, but he's immanent in a very strong sense of the word. When we talk about God's omnipresence, I think sometimes we think about it as being sort of like I am in a room. God is in the creation, but he isn't intimately involved in it. The creation isn't participating in any sense in God. God is just sort of consciously present there or something along those lines. In panentheism, God is in fact intimately and directly involved in everything, and everything is participating in some sense in God without God being dependent on it, or we've still got transcendence in there. Now, in the Orthodox world, then we're dealing with capital O Orthodox, they do this via Palamas's distinction between God's essence and his energies.
Energies, yeah.
Yeah. God's essence is something that is transcendent, that is unknowable. We cannot know.
Can never be participated in, because we can never be, the God being beyond being, that kind of, yeah.
Yeah, so that's the essence. But God's energies are in the world, and everything in the world depends on them and functions within them. And so now I should say panentheism is controversial in the Orthodox world. A lot of them don't like the word. They think it can be misleading. They think it can blur the distinction between creator and creation, between essence and energies. But among Callistus Ware, for example, he thinks that this is a useful way of understanding Palamas's energies essence distinction. That God has both, and that everything in the universe participates in God in the sense that it draws its being from him. Divine energies permeate everything.
Its being is caused by God. But the interesting thing is that Christian theism in Aquinas and Augustine are not very far removed from that same interpretation. Matter of fact, that language is the way they understand classical theism. So it really is. We don't have a great term for describing these things, so we're borrowing a term from the schools of religion, either theism or panentheism. But I think in both cases, you're right. Orthodox and Aquinas and Augustine, they're all trying to speak that all things owe themselves to God, and they never are such that they stand on their own. God is always transcendently present as their cause, their sustainer, and their final end. And how we do it is where it gets tricky, because if you don't nuance it right, you lose the transcendence, or you make God dependent on the creation to become embodied in some way to, I don't know, complete a nature or something. But orthodoxy it wants to be very careful there too, by not blurring that difference. And that's why they will not speak of energies as a participation in the essence of God. That cannot be done. It's the way in which that essence emanates towards something that isn't God.
Yeah, I think it'd be good to note at this point that sometimes Protestants make a kind of an opposite sort of error, in the sense that sometimes Protestants give the impression that there's no kind of ongoing sustaining of being by God, that we're just kind of like there, and then you finally kind of fall into a kind of atheist outlook. I've noticed that people, particularly fundamentalists, people who've grown up in a sort of unreflective kind of environment in which they don't really sort of have a sense of the assumptions that they've adopted from the surrounding culture, but they have a high regard for the scriptures. When they apostatize, almost inevitably they go hard atheist. It's not because they still believe some things that they believed back when they were fundamentalists.
yeah, they read the world the same way. Yeah,
right.
Well, fundamentalism is a product of modernity.
Yeah, which is a product of trying to disentangle creation from creator, and so suggests that the being that the creation has, it can be self-standing. In other words, it's almost like deism sets the groundwork, if we can just use an example. In other words, you have God who is being itself, who gives it to this creation, and now the creation has it and runs with it. That is not how any historic Christian understanding of the doctrine of creation is understood. That is a heresy. And that leads the world to disenchantment in the West, and it basically leads to materialism.
Yeah. Now we can add to that there is a version of panentheism that basically sees God as being influenced by the world, so that what you get, for example, is process theology or things like that,
Yeah.
where the world in process changes God.
Yes, that's like
And
Moltmann's theology as well. Jürgen Moltmann and even Wolfhart Pannenberg. His theology was indebted to that view as well.
So
yeah, and that is,
related,
again, one of these things that the Orthodox are, that's one of the reasons why panentheism is controversial within Orthodoxy, because they say, look, you're opening the door to process.
Yes.
But the others say, no, the energy essence distinction protects you against that.
Yeah.
So the thing that I think would be good again to note here, going back to the evangelical Protestant scene, is there's been a recent move away by younger not just evangelical, but even Reformed thinkers, moving away from classical theism. I think partly because they just have never been really thoroughly educated. They just don't know what they're even talking about.
Yeah, most people don't know what the classic doctrine of God entails or creation, even in the Christian church today. It's very different than what we've been taught in Sunday school.
But here's the thing. A lot of these biblicists will say that they're defending Christianity against the incursions of Greek thought, and will actually, without even realizing it, reject some of the sort of the assumptions that were present with the Westminster Divines. So if you read the Westminster Standards, it's pretty clear that all of those thinkers were acquainted with classical theist sort of understandings of God. And some of these people are even crazy enough they don't understand what classical theism is in the first place. But then in the name of Scripture, they're like kind of backing into process theology and other weird things. So like a lot of the people that I knew from back in the day who got into liberation theology, they were explicitly rejecting classical theism, and they found themselves buying into kind of a Marxist sort of take on things.
Yeah. Now, a little history on attitudes toward the Bible and Protestantism might be in order here. It's worth noting that if you go back to Luther, if you go back to Calvin, we talk about sola scriptura a lot, but we can forget that what they meant by that is that Scripture is their final authority, but there are guardrails around interpretation, which they called the rule of faith, the regula fide. There are things like the creeds.
Well, and along with it, I mean, most of these fundies or anyone else would argue that the historic grammatical tools would work on unpacking the meaning of the Bible, right? Historical grammatical tools would help you get to the meaning of the Bible, because the Bible is supposedly historical, which means there are historical realities that you need tools to get a hold of those historical realities, what happened, how to read it. But it also makes metaphysical claims, and you need a set of tools and categories to get a hold of those, but you need to make sure that they're pliable and open enough to deal with the biblical content versus not. And that's all Christianity was doing with using this language, like you said, in the creeds, homoousion. This is trying to communicate something. Ousi, the whole notion of being. They're trying to communicate a biblical truth and content with a set of tools that has the capacity to nuance what needs to be nuanced.
Now, let's take this a little bit further. How did we lose this? Well, it turns out that the idea that we just need the Bible, not the creeds, not any of those other things, that comes from 19th century liberals who
Von
brought
Harnack
that in specifically so that they could interpret their way around things they didn't like the virgin birth or the resurrection. These are just symbolic or whatever. We believe the Bible. We believe the Bible is authoritative, but we don't need the creeds to tell us that Jesus was born of a virgin. We know that was impossible. So that's just a way of talking about how special this guy was.
Yeah.
And unknowingly, evangelicals, fundamentalists, things like that, have picked up
Yeah.
on that principle of interpreting Scripture, although they haven't lost necessarily the doctrines, but they're following the liberals in terms of how they think
Yeah.
about Scripture.
Yeah.
I would say, Glenn, that they're just moving a little slower. Yes, many of the sort of popular figures that people would recognize the names of are still Orthodox in the sense that they believe in the fundamentals, like the virgin birth and so forth. But their kids and their grandkids are not, and I've witnessed it. They're getting further and further with each generation away from those things.
And they become understood merely as a flat historical event, and that's the thing. Oh, it's just in their case, but they believed it happened miraculously that way. But the wider reality implications of that, they don't have, and they've again disenchanted, if you could use the word. They've taken the mystery out of reality in relationship to this. I mean, when you have Colossians starting to apply Christ as the wisdom at the heart of all things, and the one through whom, from whom, through whom, and to whom are all things, and that he is to fill all things. Okay, that is as metaphysical as you can get. And that's not the stuff you would be reading off the surface if you just interpret him as merely is God became flesh. The earliest interpretations in the epistles themselves are reading the cosmic implications of Christ out of the historic happenings, and they're interconnected, and the church just keeps going with it. Does it get it perfect? No. That's why we had them work through these different things. Are we able to get the best term in place? Well, that's what we're talking about today. It's not always easy. Even certain definitions of theism, which grow out of the word deism, if I'm correct too, can sometimes, like you said, Chris, we could be talking more like God is the biggest thing within a shared kind of reality, which a lot of evangelicals sadly hold in biblicists, that basically we're on the same order of being. So therefore, if a human does something, God has to get out of the way, or if it's all grace, somehow the human being doesn't have to enact that with their actions, their works. So it becomes complicated once you get the metaphysical picture bad. But historically, Christians didn't work with such a narrow interpretation of things. And liberalism has done, it's done a job on people who otherwise aren't liberal theologically.
So bringing this back to the Orthodox world, one of the ways that they try to distinguish between a general pantheism or panentheism, that can lead to process and that sort of thing is by hyphenating it. So pan hyphen N hyphen theism. So God in all things is how they would interpret that. That's the sense that they're trying to get at there. Now, I'll be honest with you. I had a serious allergy to the term panentheism because of my earlier exposures to some unhealthy versions of it. But I've got to say that the Orthodox understanding of that, among those like Callistus Ware and others who use the term, I can actually see something of the charm in it. Personally, it seems like it is a good way of describing the dependence of the creation, everything in the creation, on God, which is one of these things that we don't normally think about, which would then imply God's presence in a very strong sense of the word in everything, not like me being in a room, but God's energies, to use the Greek term or the Orthodox term, God's energies actually infusing everything, causing it to exist. I mean, Colossians, he sustains everything by the word of his power.
I think conceptually the challenge that some people feel, or the discomfort that some people feel with this way of thinking, has to do with evil and sin. How are God's energies to be understood as supporting the lives of people who use those lives to do very wicked things. So I think that's where. Now, I don't think it's an insurmountable problem, but I think that's where a lot of folks recoil a little bit.
Well, the fact of the matter is that if Paul is right, that in him we live and move and have our being, then Stalin, Hitler, Pol Pot, all of those guys lived and moved and had their being in God.
Well, and Westminster will even affirm this, but what we're talking about here is the difference between the reception of our creaturely being as a creature. That's one thing. That's a creaturely good. There's a goodness of a creature. There's a goodness to being a creature, other than Judas, who they wished that it would have been better that he hadn't been born, right? But there is a goodness to all creatures in terms of them having being, because being is the good gift grounded in the goodness of the being of the Creator. So this is East or West in Christianity. But there is also a real creature. Creature is not simply I know some panentheists will tell you it's not simply a mode of the Creator. The creature is its own thing in its own reality, but it depends for its being, both what it is and that it is, on the source, God, supplying it. And it has no capacity to be without God causing it to be. The West will talk about analogy of being, because it allows for that same creator-creature distinction and connection to remain. And so really your choices are between analogy of being in the West or the essence energy in the East, if you're going to be talking any kind of Christian conception of the Trinitarian God. I still tend to prefer the analogy of being, but I don't think that what both are after are so far apart. I think, again, what we're dealing with is we're pushing language to do about as much as it can do. God, let's say in the West, God being itself, the infinite plenitude of sheer existence. You'll often hear the language simple being. Creatures aren't that. What God is by nature, creatures are only by sharing in it as a limited share by grace. And it's completely different, but the grace has to be supplied to it for it to participate in it. But we can take that grace and direct it in bad ways, and that's where the privation comes in. That's where the lack develops in what should be a good being. And so they're different vocabularies and grammars, but I think they're trying to preserve the creator-creature distinction, that God creates all things and is intimately connected to them, closer to everything is than it is to itself, and yet transcends it, never is determined or impacted by it. I'm like the Creator in the sense that I owe all of my perfections to God, but God is not like me. And both of those things are trying to be affirmed.
This connects in with something I'm working on for Reflections Ministries. Would you consider then being a kind of communicable attribute? The communicable attributes, for those of you who don't know, there are incommunicable attributes, which are things that God has and only God has. Communicable attributes are things that God shares with us, but we always have them in a limited way, never to the full perfection of these attributes that God has.
Yeah, I think, Glenn, this is where the annihilationist argument kind of rears its head. Because if we say that being is communicable and we are cut off from the source of being in the judgment, then we just wink out of existence. This is the way that the annihilationists think of this. I'm not willing to go there. I'm enough of an old school hellfire and brimstone guy, to say no. There's something that continues. I don't understand what that necessarily means. Maybe this gets us back to the limitations of language and our inability to think about these things because we're kind of beyond ourselves to a degree. But this is where, I think in my case, I become a little uncomfortable when it comes to this with the language of participation. I still believe in participation, but I don't think that it. Anyway, I think I've said enough.
Well, actually, that does raise an interesting point. If we define hell, as I've frequently heard it, as being complete separation from God. In what sense can beings in hell still exist?
You can't have being at all and be and no, there is a relation to God. It's the quality of the relationship to God. That's the thing. Anything that is at all, you're either self-standing or you're not. And what allows you to be self-standing if you aren't being by nature? You're receiving it by something that is. So, but the thing is being is one of the most self-diffusive and self-communicating realities, but it's participated in differently, not univocally. And there is in certain kinds of beings, certain kind of participation and freedom in a limited way as well. And we can do things with that. We can choose the tree of life or pick death, hell, and the grave. And that creates a different way in which, but what sustains us in terms of having being at all, if we're not sustained by a being that we're supplying for ourselves, which would be, i.e., would be God in some sense. So it's hard to speak about it any other way.
I think that, when you think about The Great Divorce, which is a marvelous work, this is what I think Lewis is struggling with.
Yeah.
In terms of his understanding of the nature of hell, and kind of the infinite shrinking. You remember the film, The Incredible Shrinking Man, where he just keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller? I think that's kind of what Lewis is thinking about there. It's like an infinite shrinking.
Yeah.
Anyway, we should probably wrap this up. We're at that time.
Time is infinitely shrinking away.
So this has been your show, Glenn. Is there anything you want to say before we wrap up?
Yeah, I very deliberately wanted to push this into some controversial areas, trying to get up to perhaps the edge of heresy, but not quite crossing it. So we're going to get letters.
Well, and I think just ending on that is we need to be thinking very clearly about what we mean by these things. Otherwise, we will be, or we may find out that we are in heresies, and it's good to dig our way out.
Well, I don't think we ended up in a heresy, but I think we did at least outline ways that things could go wrong.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we appreciate your interest in the Theology Pugcast, and we've gotten to the end of the episode. And if you'd like what we do and you want to help pay the bills, there is a link in the show notes to our Patreon page. We really do appreciate the people who give to us on a monthly basis. All right, that's enough for now. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Westminster Presbyterian Church in Battle Ground, Washington. The Theology Pugcast is produced and edited by Wiley Craft Productions of Nashville, Tennessee.